Imagine being pulled over for no reason. Imagine a cop smirking as he slaps handcuffs on you, thinking he holds all the power. But what if one phone call could flip the script?
This is Maya Reynolds. What's the situation?
When Alyssa Carter dials a direct line to the White House, the officer's confidence shatters. His smirk fades. His hands shake. And in an instant, the entire police force and the city are thrown into chaos. What secret did that call reveal? And what happened to the officer who thought he was untouchable? Stay tuned because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking stories. Alyssa Carter tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, humming along to the soft R&B playing through her car speakers. The drive from New York to Philadelphia had been long, but as she cruised through the familiar streets of West Philly, she felt a sense of ease wash over her. She hadn't visited her grandmother, Evelyn Carter, in a few months, and she could already imagine the warm hug waiting for her, the scent of fresh cornbread drifting from the kitchen, and the sound of her grandmother's laughter filling the house. It was the kind of comfort Alyssa had been craving. She slowed down as she approached a small, locally owned grocery store, one she'd stopped at countless times before. She needed to pick up a few things before heading to her grandmother's house, her way of ensuring Evelyn wouldn't fuss over needing to cook an entire meal for her. Just as she turned into the parking lot, she caught a flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror, a police cruiser. Alyssa's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Maybe they were just passing by, she told herself. Maybe they weren't here for me. But then the siren chirped, a short, sharp burst, a clear signal. They were pulling her over. Her heart began to race. She wasn't speeding, she hadn't run a red light. What reason could they possibly have to stop her? Taking a steadying breath, she flipped her turn signal on and pulled into a parking spot, putting her car in park. She reached for her phone but hesitated. Don't reach for anything too fast. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. It was a script she had memorized her entire life. Through the rearview mirror, she watched as a tall, broad-shouldered white officer stepped out of the cruiser. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the afternoon sun, and the way he walked, slow, deliberate, heavy-footed, immediately set her on edge. Alyssa swallowed hard. She wasn't new to interactions with the police. As a graduate student in public policy at NYU, she had spent years researching cases of police misconduct, wrongful arrests, and racial profiling. She had attended panels, written policy proposals, and even joined protests. But none of that prepared her for what was about to happen. The officer reached her driver's side window and knocked hard. She rolled it down just enough to speak. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The man, his name tag reading R. Klein, didn't acknowledge her greeting. He didn't even make eye contact. Instead, his jaw tightened and he simply said, "License and registration." Alyssa blinked. No explanation. No reason for the stop. She kept her voice polite but firm. "Can you tell me why I'm being pulled over?" Klein let out a slow, heavy sigh as if she had just inconvenienced him. "Your tags are expired." That made Alyssa frown. "No, they weren't." "That's not correct," she said. "I renewed them last month." Klein's lips twitched, something between a smirk and a sneer. "Well, looks like you don't know your own business." Alyssa exhaled sharply through her nose, pushing down the frustration bubbling up in her chest. "Don't escalate. Stay calm." "I have the renewal confirmation on my phone," she offered. "I can show you." "Step out of the vehicle." Alyssa froze. "Wait, what? I just told you my tags aren't expired," I said. "Step out of the car." His hand hovered over his holster. The cold weight of fear settled in her stomach. She had a choice. She could argue, demand answers, demand her rights, or she could comply, do what was necessary to get out of this situation alive. Her fingers trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly pushed open the car door. She barely had time to straighten up before Klein spun her around, yanked her arms behind her back, and slapped cold metal cuffs onto her wrists. "You're under arrest," he announced. Alyssa's breath came in sharp gasps. "For what?" "I haven't done anything wrong." Klein's grip on her arms tightened. "Resisting an officer and driving with illegal tags." Her head snapped around. "Resisting? I didn't resist anything." "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I can add more if I need to." A crowd had started to gather. People watched from the sidewalk, phones held up, recording everything. A woman nearby yelled, "She didn't do anything. You can't just arrest her." Klein barely glanced at them before turning back to Alyssa. "Smile for the camera," he said with a smirk. And then he laughed, a sharp, mocking laugh that sent rage burning through her veins. Alyssa's face burned with humiliation, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about power. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was enjoying it, and that's when it hit her. He thought she was powerless, but he had no idea who he had just arrested. Alyssa straightened her back. She was cuffed, but she was not helpless. She wasn't just a random woman in a traffic stop. She was someone with connections in high places. And if he thought this was going to end the way he wanted, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The cold, hard plastic of the squad car's backseat pressed against Alyssa Carter's spine. Her wrists ached from the too tight cuffs, and her heartbeat pounded in her ears, fast and erratic. She was trying to stay calm, but it was impossible. Her mind raced through every possibility. How long would she be held? Would they charge her? Would she be stuck in a holding cell for hours, maybe even days? No, she couldn't let that happen. She had read too many stories, studied too many cases. She knew what happened to black people falsely arrested, how the system dragged things out, how charges piled up for no reason, how even a minor arrest could ruin a person's life. She needed to act, and fast. Alyssa shifted slightly, testing how much movement her hands could manage behind her back. Her phone was still in her coat pocket, her one lifeline. She had one chance to get help before they took it away at the station. Alyssa's mind locked onto one name, Maya Reynolds. Maya had been one of her mentors during her internship at the White House Office of Public Engagement. She was now a senior official, someone with direct connections to the people who could make things happen fast. If Alyssa could reach her, everything could change. But first, she needed to unlock her phone. The squad car jerked forward, forcing Alyssa against the seat. Klein, sitting in the front, chuckled as he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Comfy back there," he sneered. She ignored him. Her fingers fumbled in her coat pocket, straining against the cuffs. Just a little more, the tip of her index finger brushed the edge of her phone screen. "Yes," she took a deep breath. Then, in the quietest voice she could manage, she whispered, "Hey Siri, call Maya Reynolds." A brief pause. Then, calling Maya Reynolds. The sound of ringing filled the car. Klein's smug expression vanished. At first, he didn't react. But when his gaze landed on her phone screen, his eyes widened in shock. Alyssa saw the Washington, D.C. area code flashing on the screen. 202. It was the kind of number only government offices had. Klein whipped around in his seat, his face going from red to an alarming shade of pale. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, reaching back to grab for the phone. But he was too slow. A voice crackled through the speaker. "Hello, Alyssa." "Maya." Alyssa's heart nearly burst from her chest. She raised her voice, making sure Maya could hear every word before Klein ripped the phone away. "Maya, it's me. I've been falsely arrested in Philadelphia by an officer named Robert Klein." Klein lunged. His fingers closed around the phone, yanking it from her pocket. He stabbed the screen with his thumb, trying to end the call, but the damage was already done. Alyssa saw it the moment he realized what had just happened. The call had gone through, and Maya Reynolds had heard everything. Klein froze. His hand still clutched the phone, his chest rising and falling in quick, erratic breaths. His face was completely drained of color. His jaw clenched. His nostrils flared. His fingers trembled. Then suddenly he stumbled backward. His legs buckled, his hand clutched at his chest. He let out a gasping, wheezing sound as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. Then he collapsed, flat on his back, right there in the middle of the street. The crowd outside the squad car erupted in shock. Other officers rushed forward. "Klein, what's happening? Are you okay?" One of them dropped down beside him, pressing a hand to his shoulder. Klein was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. Another officer grabbed his radio. "We need an ambulance now." The crowd was still filming, capturing every second of the chaos. Someone shouted, "What the hell did she say to him?" From inside the squad car, Alyssa watched it all unfold. She should have felt relieved, maybe even vindicated. Instead, she just felt cold, calculating calm. This was only the beginning. The real storm was coming, and Alyssa Carter was ready. Maya Reynolds had just sat down at her desk in the White House Office of Public Engagement when her phone rang. She frowned at the screen. Alyssa Carter. She hadn't heard from her former intern in months, but Alyssa was a sharp, determined young woman, someone Maya had always admired. If she was calling now, it had to be serious. "Hello, Alyssa." The response came in a frantic rush of words. "Maya, it's me. I've been falsely arrested in Philadelphia by an officer named Robert Klein." Then silence. The line went dead. Maya's breath hitched in her throat. She tried calling back, voicemail. She tried again, still nothing. Something was very, very wrong. She immediately stood, grabbed her tablet and marched out of her office. She had no time to waste. The halls of the West Wing were bustling with energy, but Maya barely noticed. She navigated the maze of offices until she reached the one she needed, senior advisor to the president, John Ramirez. She knocked twice, then pushed open the door. Ramirez, a seasoned political strategist, was hunched over a stack of reports, sipping his coffee. He glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Maya, what's wrong?" She didn't hesitate. "Sir, we have a problem in Philadelphia." And then she told him everything. Ramirez acted fast. Within minutes, he was on the phone with the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, relaying what Maya had told him. A black woman, a graduate student, falsely arrested. A racist cop. A suspiciously abrupt call cut off. A potentially dangerous situation unfolding. The Dodge's response was immediate. "We're on it," said an official. "We'll launch an inquiry now." Within the hour, the Philadelphia Police Department received a direct order from the DOJ. Provide all reports, body cam footage, and arrest records related to the detainment of Alyssa Carter. No charges are to be filed against her until we have reviewed this case. Failure to comply will result in immediate federal intervention. The Philadelphia PD was now in the spotlight, and the media was about to make it worse. Back in Philadelphia, the scene outside the grocery store had turned into chaos. Officer Robert Klein was still being loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale as paramedics checked his vitals. But no one was paying attention to him anymore, because the videos had already hit the internet. A white cop arresting a black woman over a bogus charge. The way he mocked her in front of the crowd, and then his sudden collapse the moment he saw who she had called. The clip spread like wildfire. In less than an hour, it had been shared tens of thousands of times. By the second hour, the hashtag Justice for Alyssa was trending on Twitter. By the third hour, news anchors were covering the story. CNN, MSNBC, even local Philadelphia stations. Tonight, growing outrage over a Philadelphia officer's arrest of a black woman, an arrest that ended with the officer collapsing after learning who she had contacted. People wanted answers. But instead of addressing the issue, Philadelphia PD made a critical mistake. They tried to stay silent, and silence only made it worse. At the DOJ, A team of investigators was already combing through Officer Robert Klein's record, and what they found was deeply disturbing. Multiple complaints of racial profiling. Several reports of excessive force, none of which had resulted in disciplinary action. Dozens of traffic stops involving black drivers that led to impoundments. The last detail raised a red flag. Why so many impoundments? They kept digging, and then they found it. A suspicious connection between Klein and a private towing company. A pattern of illegal vehicle seizures. A scheme where officers like Klein would target drivers, mostly black, mostly lower income, on bogus charges. And once the car was towed, the owner would be forced to pay exorbitant fees to get it back. Many never got their cars back at all. It was a racket. And Klein wasn't just a racist cop. He was a corrupt one. By the time the DOJ confronted Philadelphia PD, the department was already buckling under pressure. Reporters were demanding a statement. Activists were calling for Klein's immediate termination. City officials were getting flooded with calls. The police chief called an emergency meeting. His voice was tight, furious. Fix this, now. But there was no easy way out. The DOJ was watching them. The White House was watching them, and the entire nation was watching them. They couldn't bury this story. They couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about an entire system of abuse. And now they had no choice but to face it. Alyssa sat in a small, dimly lit holding cell, her wrists still sore from the cuffs. She had no idea what was happening outside. She didn't know her name was all over the news. She didn't know the DOJ had launched an investigation. She didn't know that Officer Robert Klein had just become a national disgrace. All she knew was she had made the right call. She had used the only weapon she had, her voice. And now, the fight for justice had begun. The weight of what was happening finally hit Officer Robert Klein the moment he was forced to turn in his badge. One day, he had been untouchable, a cop who could stop whoever he wanted, make up whatever charges he pleased, and get away with it every single time. Now he was suspended without pay, facing criminal charges, and about to stand trial in one of the most high-profile cases in the country. And it all started because one black woman made a phone call. When the DOJ formally indicted Klein, the list of charges was damning. Abuse of power, unjustified stops, racial profiling, and illegal arrests. Civil rights violations, repeated targeting of black drivers under false pretenses. Corruption and fraudulent business dealings, a scheme where Klein would have innocent drivers' cars towed, then receive kickbacks from a private towing company. What was once dismissed as just another bad cop case had exploded into a full-scale corruption scandal. And Philadelphia PD wasn't prepared for the fallout. The chief of police was scrambling. City officials were panicking. Internal Affairs had no choice but to reopen dozens of old complaints against Klein, complaints that had been quietly dismissed over the years. Activists and civil rights attorneys were flooding the media, pointing out that Klein was just one of many. How many more officers are getting away with this? Reporters demanded. Philadelphia's mayor was forced to call a press conference trying to control the narrative. "We take these allegations seriously," he said. "We are committed to justice." But no one believed him. The people wanted accountability, and that meant Klein had to go down, hard. For Alyssa Carter, the days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind. She had gone from being a wrongfully arrested graduate student to a national symbol of justice. Her face was everywhere, news reports, interviews, even viral social media posts. Some people supported her, saying she was brave for standing up. Others hated her for it. She's just looking for attention. Typical crying racism instead of following the law. This is why people don't trust cops anymore, because of victims like her. The hate didn't surprise her, but it didn't scare her either. She knew the truth, and she was ready to tell it. The courtroom was packed: reporters, activists, Philadelphia residents. Everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Klein sat at the defense table, his once proud posture now slouched, his face lined with exhaustion. The prosecution wasted no time tearing him apart. They brought in the DOJ investigators, who laid out the pattern of his crimes. They played footage of him mocking Alyssa during the arrest, proving his abuse of power. They exposed his connection to the towing company, showing bank records of illegal payments. They called former victims to the stand, black men and women who had been targeted by Klein before Alyssa but never got justice. And then it was Alyssa's turn to testify. The room fell silent as she walked up to the witness stand. She took a deep breath, her hands steady, her back straight. The prosecutor approached. "Miss Carter, can you describe what happened on the day of your arrest?" Alyssa looked directly at the jury, a group of 12 people who would decide whether or not Klein would finally be held accountable. And she told them everything. How Klein pulled her over for no reason. How he refused to listen when she tried to explain her registration was valid. How he humiliated her in front of a crowd. And how he laughed in her face, knowing she had no power until she made that call. The jury was hanging onto her every word, and when she finished, she looked straight at Klein. He wouldn't meet her eyes. The trial only lasted 2 days. By the time the jury was sent to deliberate, it was already clear how this was going to end. They were gone for less than 4 hours before they returned with their decision. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge read the verdict. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. On the charge of corruption, guilty. One by one, every single charge came back as guilty. When the final verdict was read, Alyssa exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of her chair. She had won. Klein sank into his seat, his hands trembling, his face a mask of disbelief. The judge turned to him. "Robert Klein, you have violated the public trust. You have abused your position. You have betrayed the people you swore to protect." Then came the final blow. "I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others cried, and Klein sat there completely frozen, his entire world crumbling around him. By the end of the day, Robert Klein was officially stripped of his badge, fired from the police force, on his way to federal prison. Philadelphia PD was left scrambling. The police chief announced mandatory bias training for all officers. The city council voted to establish a new civilian oversight board, and the DOJ continued investigating other officers linked to Klein's towing scam. For Alyssa, it wasn't just about one conviction. It was about sending a message that cops like Klein couldn't keep getting away with this, and that justice, when fought for, could still be won. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun warming her skin, she finally let out the breath she had been holding. It wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time since that day in West Philly, she felt free. Alyssa Carter never expected to become a national symbol of justice reform. She never imagined that one wrongful arrest would ignite a movement, or that her name would be spoken in the halls of power. She had only wanted to visit her grandmother in Philadelphia. Instead, she had helped expose a corrupt system, and now people were looking to her to help change it. The fallout from the trial of Officer Robert Klein was felt across Philadelphia. The public outrage didn't end with his conviction. It only grew stronger. Protesters flooded City Hall, demanding more than just one officer's downfall. Civil rights groups pushed for deep structural reforms. Politicians scrambled to address the crisis. And then, under intense national pressure, the city had no choice but to act. Philadelphia officials announced sweeping police reforms. Mandatory body cameras for all officers, no more lost footage. No more excuses. An independent civilian oversight board, a panel with real power to investigate complaints and hold officers accountable. Stronger enforcement against racial profiling officers would be retrained, with severe penalties for misconduct. It was a massive shift, and Alyssa was at the center of it all. One morning, Alyssa woke up to an email that made her breath catch in her throat. Subject: invitation to the White House. She stared at the screen. She read the words over and over again. The president wanted to meet her. Her hands trembled as she read further. She had been invited to a roundtable discussion on police accountability, featuring civil rights leaders, policy experts, and law enforcement officials, and she was one of the key voices. Alyssa sat back, stunned. Just a few weeks ago, she had been sitting in the back of a squad car, terrified and humiliated. Now she was about to walk into the most powerful building in the country, not as a victim, but as a changemaker. The morning of the meeting, Alyssa found herself standing outside the White House gates, heart pounding. She smoothed her blazer, adjusted her bag, and took a deep breath. Then she stepped forward. Inside, she was greeted by Maya Reynolds, the woman who had answered her call that day, the call that had changed everything. "Look at you," Maya said, smiling. "Told you we had your back." Alyssa smiled, but inside she was still processing it all. Moments later, she was led into a grand conference room where officials, activists, and law enforcement representatives were already seated. She recognized some of them: civil rights lawyers, mayors, even police chiefs from different states. Then the room fell silent. The side door opened, and the President of the United States walked in. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. He shook hands with a few people, then turned toward her. "Alyssa Carter," he said warmly, "it's an honor to have you here." She shook his hand, still in disbelief. Then they all took their seats and the discussion began. The president started the meeting by addressing the room. "We're here today because we know the system is broken," he said, "and we need real solutions. That's why I want to hear directly from those affected." Then he turned to Alyssa. "Miss Carter, your story shook the nation. Tell us, what changes do you think we need to make?" Alyssa felt every eye in the room on her. She took a deep breath, and she spoke her truth. She described what it felt like to be pulled over for no reason. She explained how it wasn't just about one bad cop, but a broken system. She demanded that no one should need White House connections to get justice. "What happened to me happens to people every day," she said. "The only difference is I had someone to call, but what about those who don't?" She looked around the room, her voice firm. "We need stronger oversight, we need accountability, and we need to make sure that no one, no matter their race or background, ever has to go through what I went through." The room was silent for a long moment. Then the president nodded. "You're absolutely right," he said, "and we're going to do something about it." After the meeting, Alyssa was asked to give an interview on national television. Sitting across from the reporter, she was asked, "Alyssa, how does it feel to go from being falsely arrested to influencing national policy?" She smiled faintly. "Honestly, it's surreal. I just wanted to visit my grandmother," she said. "Instead, I helped change a broken system." She paused, then looked directly into the camera. "But this isn't just my fight. This is for every person who has ever been targeted unfairly. This is for those who don't have the connections I did. We can't stop here." She leaned forward. One phone call, one act of courage, and a united community can bring down an unjust system. The interview went viral, and Alyssa Carter, she was no longer just a victim of police injustice. She was a leader in the movement to fix it. Philadelphia enacted its biggest police reform in decades. Cities across the country began reviewing their own policies. And Alyssa Carter became a force for change. She continued her studies in public policy, but now with a new mission: to make sure the system she once feared could actually serve the people fairly. One day, as she sat in her grandmother's kitchen, scrolling through the latest news coverage of her work. Evelyn Carter smiled at her. "You know," her grandmother said, "I always knew you were going to change the world." Alyssa laughed softly, shaking her head. "I just made a phone call, Nana." Her grandmother squeezed her hand. "Yeah, but you made the right one." And that was what mattered. One phone call, one act of courage, and a united community can bring down an unjust system.